I had counted the days, 9 years of waking up before the sun, hands blistered from work, dinners of soup and crackers when everyone else ordered takeout. 9 years of saying no to vacations, to new shoes, to Friday nights out. And finally, the bank's letter had arrived, plain and official. My mortgage was gone. The house was mine. In a country where owning a home feels like climbing Mount Everest, I had done it alone. That evening, I walked through my modest two-bedroom in Portland, running my hand along the doorframe, as though to remind myself it was really mine. I thought about how, in America, especially for women in their 30s without a husband or children, owning a home is often treated as a miracle or an indulgence. For me, it was neither. It was proof of survival. I wanted my family to share this pride with me. Maybe it was foolish, but I hoped their eyes would shine with the same joy that filled my chest. I remembered a line by Maya Angelou. I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. Those words had carried me through nights when the bills piled too high. As I set the table, I told myself, this should have been the happiest night of my life. But even then, a shadow whispered that not everyone would see it that way. I cooked a meal better than anything I'd allowed myself for years. Herb-roasted chicken, roasted vegetables, a salad tossed with fresh olive oil. On the counter, waiting, was the indulgence I'd denied myself for so long. A dark chocolate cake, frosted thick and glossy. I poured a bottle of wine I'd been saving, setting the glasses carefully in place. The house smelled warm, savory, welcoming. Yet when the door finally opened, nearly 40 minutes late, my parents walked in like guests at a diner. My mother looked around without seeing the lit candles or the flowers on the table. "Well, that's nice, honey," she said, already shrugging off her coat. "But let's eat first. We're starving." Roxalana followed, scrolling on her phone, barely lifting her eyes. Dorian, her fiancé, spoke louder than anyone else in the room. He launched into a story about traffic on the freeway, about a co-worker's incompetence, about anything but me. I tried to guide them toward the table, but conversation rushed around me like water around a stone. My mother mentioned rising grocery prices. My father grunted agreement. Roxalana tapped at her screen, smiling faintly at some message. Dorian laughed at his own joke, and everyone laughed with him. I smiled too, though my jaw ached. Their words blurred into a chorus of indifference. I caught phrases like, "Don't make a big deal out of it," and "It's not like you've got kids to worry about." I kept passing the chicken, pouring the wine, nodding, while the air thickened around me. On the surface, it looked like a family dinner. Underneath, it felt like invisibility wearing me down bite by bite. I had rehearsed the sentence in my mind all week. When the plate settled and the moment seemed quiet enough, I drew a breath. "I have some news," I said, my voice steady but proud. They glanced up, forks pausing in midair. "I paid off my mortgage," I continued. "The house is completely mine now. No bank, no debt. It's all mine." For a heartbeat, silence held. I expected clapping, or at least smiles. Instead, my mother blinked and said flatly, "That's nice." My father nodded, still chewing, his eyes fixed on his plate. Roxalana murmured something that sounded like, "Good for you," her tone drifting like a cloud. Dorian didn't even lift his head. He speared another carrot, shrugged, and kept eating. The silence pressed on me harder than any argument could have. If I had announced I'd won the lottery, would they have looked this bored too? I glanced at the cake waiting patiently on the counter, the one indulgence I had allowed myself. Its candles remained unlit. My chest tightened with disappointment so sharp it almost made me laugh. I swallowed, smiled politely, and let the moment pass. But inside I knew indifference was rarely harmless. It was often the first sign of something darker. Earlier that day, I had imagined it differently. I saw us clinking glasses, laughing, the wine spilling a little as we toasted. I pictured my parents telling neighbors proudly, "Our daughter owns her home outright." I imagined Roxalana hugging me, maybe even Dorian giving me a nod of respect. Instead, the reality was quieter and lonelier. No one touched the cake. The wine was poured but left half full, ignored in favor of water. Conversation never circled back to me. It floated to rent increases, to someone's promotion, to vacation plans I hadn't been invited to join. Finally, I rose, cut the cake myself, and carried slices around. My mother accepted hers without comment. My father didn't look up. Roxalana set hers aside untouched, and Dorian waved his hand as though it were irrelevant. I sat back down with a slice of my own, sweet chocolate heavy in my mouth, bitter against my throat. Surrounded by the people who should have been proudest of me, I celebrated alone. An old saying drifted through my mind. You can't choose your family, but you can choose who gets a seat at your table. I looked around at the faces bent away from me, at the cake no one tasted, and wondered whether I had invited the wrong people to mine. The candles burned low, the plates cooled, laughter rose around stories that didn't include me. I stared at the untouched cake, my fork idle. The air felt heavier than it had in years. Maybe this wasn't just indifference. Maybe it was the beginning of something far uglier. And then Dorian smirked across the table and called me something I would never forget. The word hit the table like a glass shattering. Dorian leaned back in his chair, that smug grin curling at the corners of his mouth, and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Little tenant." The room froze. My fork hovered halfway to my lips. My parents stopped chewing. Even Roxalana blinked in surprise. For a moment, the only sound was the clock ticking above the mantel. The laughter from his earlier story died instantly. I sat there, staring at him, my chest tightening as if he'd yanked the air from the room. Little tenant? That's what he thought of me, after all I had done. Not homeowner, not provider, just a squatter in my own house. I could feel the humiliation flood my cheeks, but I forced my voice to stay calm inside my head. Americans love to repeat, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." Yet when those words come from the people closest to you, they cut deeper than anything else. In that second, I didn't feel reduced to a tenant by a stranger's insult. I felt erased from my own life by the silence around the table. Dorian wasn't finished. He leaned forward, stabbing at his plate with his fork as though nothing unusual had happened. "Well, she's just the little tenant until real family takes over. You know, when Roxalana and I get married, it'll be different." My sister let out a nervous laugh, fiddling with her napkin. "Don't say it like that," she muttered, but she didn't correct him. My mother kept her gaze lowered, eyes fixed on her plate as though the roasted chicken deserved all her attention. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. No one stood up for me. I swallowed, forcing my hands to stay steady. Anger bubbled hot in my stomach, but I bit it back. There are moments when silence is not weakness, it's strategy. I wanted to see just how far they would go. 2 of our neighbors had been invited that night. They had stopped by to bring over wine and stayed when the dinner stretched longer. Their presence made it worse. It wasn't just an insult in private. It was a humiliation broadcast to people who knew us. I could almost feel their judgment sliding across the table toward me. 9 years of sacrifice, of bills scraped together and dinners skipped, dismissed in a single sentence. My hands built this home, my sweat watered the garden outside, and my name signed every check that kept the roof standing. Yet here I sat, being branded as a tenant in the very place I had fought to own. Shame seared through me, then anger so sharp I nearly trembled. And beneath it all came something colder. A clarity I hadn't felt before. If this was how they dared to speak in front of me, what were they plotting when I wasn't in the room? I waited for someone to correct him, to call out the cruelty. Instead, my father chuckled faintly, shaking his head as if to smooth the tension. "Don't take it so seriously," he muttered. "He's joking. Joking." My mother nodded quickly, still not meeting my eyes. "Yes, it's just a figure of speech. Don't make a scene over nothing." Roxalana leaned toward me, her voice low but sharp. "He didn't mean it. Stop being dramatic." And there it was, the pattern I knew too well. Gaslighting, dismissing, turning my pain into an overreaction. Inside, my thoughts spun. The worst betrayal doesn't come from insults. It comes from the silence of the ones who should defend you. Their unwillingness to confront him hurt more than his words. I felt the coil tighten in my chest. This wasn't an accident. This was how they truly saw me. Disposable, secondary, easy to push aside. The evening dragged on, though the food had lost its taste. My parents filled the silence with small talk. Roxalana busied herself with her phone, and Dorian smirked every time his eyes met mine. I excused myself to clear the plates, needing a moment away from the table. As I carried dishes into the kitchen, I caught sight of something that stopped me cold. Dorian leaned casually against the counter, spinning a key on his finger, the metal clinking against his wedding band with each turn. I set the plates down slowly. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my voice steady but low. He didn't flinch. "Your mom gave it to me," he said, smirk widening. "She said it'd be easier this way." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "Easier for what?" "For us," he replied, shrugging as if it were the most natural thing. "We'll be moving in eventually. No point in pretending otherwise." The world seemed to tilt. My mother, my own mother, had handed him a key, access to everything I had fought to build, every corner of the home I bled to keep. She hadn't asked me, she hadn't even told me. She had given away my trust like a spare napkin at the table. The metallic clink of the key echoed louder than any insult. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the floor under me shift from security to violation. Keys aren't just metal, they are trust, boundaries, ownership, and mine had been stripped without my consent. I gripped the edge of the counter, steadying myself as he tossed the key in the air and caught it again. He didn't see the betrayal in my mother's act. He reveled in it. Inside, my thoughts roared. This isn't carelessness, it's a declaration. They don't see me as the owner. They see me as someone to be pushed aside. I turned to the sink, staring at the faucet as the noise of the dining room drifted back in. Their laughter, their chatter, the clink of glasses, it all sounded distant now, as though I had already stepped outside of it. This was no longer about an insult at dinner. It was war declared on my independence. Maybe they thought they could reduce me to a tenant. But soon, they would learn who really held the deed. The words "little tenant" stayed with me like a song you can't shake off, repeating louder in the silence that followed. I carried them around the next morning, the next afternoon, and into the days that followed. They echoed in the way my sister avoided eye contact, in how my mother's voice softened with Dorian while sharpening at me, and even in the way my father sat back as though my presence at the table was less than hers. It wasn't just an insult tossed over dinner. It became a lens through which every shift in their behavior looked sharper. I remembered something Maya Angelou once said. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I tried to convince myself Dorian had been joking, but I couldn't ignore the truth I'd glimpsed behind his grin. Words spoken once in arrogance have a way of returning in action. I started to notice the subtle betrayals stacking up. Conversations paused when I entered the room, quiet exchanges between Roxalana and my mother that ended with sudden smiles, and the way Dorian carried himself in my home as though testing its fit. That sense of unease followed me to my parents' house one evening, where it found proof waiting behind a half-closed door. I was walking down the hallway toward the kitchen when I heard voices slipping from the study. My mother's tone, low and decisive, carried through the crack of the door. "It's better this way. Sofrona doesn't need the house. She's single." My breath caught. Roxalana's voice followed, light but edged with certainty. "Exactly. We can start our family there. She'll manage somehow. She always does." Then Dorian's smooth baritone chimed in, casual as though they were dividing chores. "By summer it'll be ours. She'll get over it." The words sliced colder than the March air drifting in through the window. I froze, my hand hovering over the wall for balance. Inside my head, everything unraveled. They weren't just careless with their words at dinner, they were making decisions about my life without me. They had turned my home into a pawn, a resource to be shifted to whoever needed it more. I leaned closer, every syllable weighing like iron. My mother again. "She'll understand if you explain it right. After all, family has to share." Roxalana laughed softly. "She doesn't have a husband or kids. It only makes sense." I felt the chill run down my spine. Not strangers, my own blood. I stepped back quietly, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Betrayal didn't just knock at the door. It was already inside, sitting comfortably in the family study. The despair was sharp, but clarity cut deeper. I finally understood. This wasn't about a thoughtless insult. It was a plan. I didn't storm in. I didn't slam the door open or confront them right then. I walked past, out the back door, into the cold air, and let the voices fade behind me. Confrontation at that moment would have been wasted. They would deny it, smooth it over, laugh at my misunderstanding. I'd seen that pattern too many times. Instead, I walked and thought about family hierarchies that thread through American households, how the oldest child is often granted authority simply by being firstborn, while the youngest is expected to share, to bend, to make peace. I thought of how often women like me, unmarried at 34, are told our sacrifices are less valuable because they don't extend to children. 9 years of cutting back, of driving the same worn-out car, of patching my jeans instead of buying new ones. Yet they spoke as though my home was a spare toy in a box they could hand off. It is one thing to be overlooked. It is another to be erased. And betrayal stings most when it is deliberate, not accidental. That night, I decided silence would be my armor, not surrender. I would wait, watch, let them dig their own pit. A few days later, I returned to my house after work, hoping for the comfort of its walls, the steady rhythm of my evening routine. But when I opened the door, the sight waiting for me stripped even that sense of safety. Dorian sat sprawled on my sofa, remote in hand, feet propped boldly on my coffee table. The television flickered, casting shadows across his face, making him look less like a guest and more like an intruder comfortable in his claim. I set my bag down slowly. "What are you doing here?" He glanced up, smirk curling. "Your mom said I could wait here, make myself comfortable." He tapped the remote against his leg, as if punctuation. I crossed my arms. "This is my house, Dorian. You don't get to make yourself comfortable here." He leaned back further, eyes gleaming with arrogance. "Relax. We're family. Besides, soon it'll be our place anyway." Might as well get used to it. The audacity took my breath away. He wasn't sneaking in. He was settling in, as though the paper with my name on it was already a relic waiting to be replaced. I didn't shout. I didn't demand he leave. I studied him, letting the silence stretch, watching him squirm just slightly under the weight of my gaze. Inside, though, I vowed, they think silence means surrender. They're wrong. The flicker of the TV light painted him in moving shadows, and all I could see was a trespasser sitting in the living room I had built from years of sacrifice. My sanctuary was being claimed like a prize, and yet, even as fury pressed against my ribs, a sharper truth anchored me. I wasn't beaten. I was preparing. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, every creak of the house reminding me that the enemy wasn't at the door anymore. He was inside, carrying my key, sitting on my furniture, plotting in my parents' study. They were already treating me like I didn't exist, as though my role had been written out of their story. But I knew better. I wasn't the kind of tenant who paid rent. I was the owner, and soon enough, I'd be the one collecting. I woke early that Saturday, scrolling absent-mindedly on my phone while sipping coffee at the kitchen table. It was supposed to be a quiet morning, one of those rare pauses when the week's labor finally slowed enough for me to hear myself think. Instead, my thumb froze mid-swipe when a photo filled my screen. Roxalana and Dorian standing in front of my house, smiling like realtors who had just closed the deal of their lives. The caption beneath the picture made my breath catch. Finally moving into our dream home. I stared at the words until they blurred. My own living room lights glowed behind them in the photo, my carefully tended garden framing their smug faces. Within minutes, the post had gathered dozens of comments. "Congratulations! Perfect place to start your family. You two deserve this." It wasn't just a photo, it was a public erasure. I felt fury rise, hot and disorienting. But beneath it lay something sharper, shock at how quickly they had gone public with their theft. In America, once something is posted online, it becomes reality in the eyes of others. There's a saying I'd heard too many times: perception is stronger than truth when everyone believes the lie. That morning, scrolling through the lies written under their picture, I saw my truth shrinking into the background. I clicked the comments, each one pressing harder on my chest. Friends of Roxalana wrote, "Can't wait to visit." Looks beautiful, such a blessing. Some tagged others, spreading the lie wider. Not one word mentioned me, not even a nod that I existed. The post wasn't just an insult, it was theft of my story. For 9 years I had saved, sweated, sacrificed, and now the narrative belonged to them. It was my walls, my roof, my garden, but their dream home. I hovered over the keyboard, the temptation to reply clawing at me. I imagined typing, "This is my house, paid in full, and you are trespassers." But I stopped. Public fights rarely serve the one telling the truth. People believe the loudest voice, not the most accurate one. I chose silence, for now, though my hand trembled as I set the phone down. Their betrayal had gone viral, but I wasn't going to let them know how deeply it cut. Not yet. The next day we sat at my parents' dinner table. My mother ladled soup as if nothing had shifted, though the air was brittle. I had promised myself I'd stay calm, but the sight of Roxalana scrolling through her phone, smiling at the very post that mocked me, broke my restraint. "Why did you say it's your house?" I asked, voice steady though my jaw ached. She glanced up, her face unreadable. "People understand what we meant. Don't be petty." "Petty?" I leaned forward. "You posed in front of my house and announced to the world that it's yours." My father cleared his throat. "She's just sharing her joy." "Don't ruin it." I turned to him. "Joy built on a lie isn't joy. It's theft dressed up for pictures." My mother frowned, waving her hand as though brushing away dust. "You always take things too seriously. Family should support family. Don't pick fights." In that moment, the truth crystallized. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't sloppy phrasing. It was deliberate. And worse, my parents were helping them cover it. I sat back, forcing my voice to remain calm. Sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's storing power, waiting for the right moment to unleash it. That weekend, I pulled into my driveway later than usual, grocery bags heavy in the back seat. I noticed an extra car parked outside, a shiny SUV I didn't recognize. The sound of laughter floated out from my house. Panic tightened my stomach. I pushed open the door, and what I saw made my hands clench around the paper bags. Dorian stood in the center of my living room, grinning as he waved his arm toward the hallway. "Ma, this will be our master bedroom," he announced to two of his friends, who chuckled and nodded as though on a tour. He turned, pointing to the back. "And that room will be perfect for the kids once they come along." They laughed again, comfortable in the walls I had bled for. I stood in the doorway, stunned, as if invisible. My voice cut through their chatter. "This is my house. What are you doing?" Dorian turned, smile widening. "Just showing our friends the future," he said smoothly. The future. As if I had already been erased from it. The walls I had painted, the floors I had scrubbed on my knees, echoed now with their laughter. It wasn't just an invasion, it was theft of dignity. They weren't sneaking in shamefully, they were parading as though I had ceased to exist. I dropped the bags onto the counter, every sound louder than it should be. My body wanted to shout, to throw them out, but my mind anchored me. Outrage was fuel, but timing was everything. Inside, I swore to myself. If they thought I'd roll over, they underestimated me. That night I lay in bed, phone screen glowing in the dark as I scrolled through the post again. Dozens more comments had piled up, the lie spreading unchecked. I heard Dorian's voice replay in my mind, smug and careless. Just showing our friends the future. They weren't planning to take my house, they were already living in it, at least in their minds. I set the phone on the nightstand, staring at the ceiling, every nerve alive with anger. Evidence. That would be my weapon. If perception had become reality for them, then I would prepare the truth strong enough to shatter it. Because this wasn't just about walls and furniture anymore, it was about erasure. And I wasn't going to let them write me out of my own life. The last few weeks had been a blur of insults, evasions, and shameless performances inside my own home. Dorian parading through my living room, Roxalana smiling for cameras in front of my door, and my parents dismissing every one of my protests. It was a cycle that replayed itself in my mind every night. I could feel the pressure mounting, pressing on my chest as if daring me to explode. I thought of a quote I once read, "Silence is the most powerful scream." For too long, mine had been echoing unheard. The weight of my quiet patience was nearing its end, and I knew that sooner or later they would push me to the point where I would have no choice but to speak in a language they could not ignore. Action. That Saturday, at my parents' house, my patience reached its edge. The evening started ordinarily enough. The table smelled of roasted turkey. The chatter was casual, almost too calm. I poured myself water and sat, watching my family avoid my eyes. But soon, their whispers turned bold, spoken without shame, as though I weren't even in the room. My mother leaned toward my father, her voice low but clear. "It's better if Roxalana and Dorian start their life in Sophrona's house. She doesn't have children. She'll be fine." My father nodded, chewing, his words casual, almost careless. "It's practical. Family first, right?" Roxalana smirked, glancing at me like a cat catching a mouse. "Think of it as your contribution to the family legacy." My fork clattered against my plate. I looked at each of them, my voice, even though my chest burned. "This house is mine. It is not a dowry, not a bargaining chip, not a prize to hand out. You can dress it in tradition all you want, but theft wrapped in family words is still theft." No one answered. The silence was heavier than any denial. My mother pushed the mashed potatoes closer to my father, pretending not to hear. My father sighed, muttering about harmony. Roxalana smiled faintly, sipping her wine as if she had won. Inside, my thought was sharp. They wanted to erase my ownership with one sentence. I set my glass down carefully, meeting their eyes one by one. "If you keep speaking as if my house is yours, there will be consequences." My father chuckled under his breath. "You're overreacting again. Don't ruin dinner with drama." My mother scolded gently. "Why must you always take things so seriously? We're talking about family. Stop making it about yourself." Roxalana shook her head, dismissing me with a sigh. "No one's stealing from you. Stop being so defensive." But I knew better. This wasn't miscommunication. It was intentional, calculated, and sanctioned by silence. I leaned back in my chair, forcing calm into my voice. "It isn't drama. It's theft disguised as tradition, and you won't like what happens if you push me further." They carried on as though I hadn't spoken, filling their plates, passing bread. My words fell into the void they had created, swallowed whole by denial. But in my chest, patience had burned itself out, leaving only steel behind. Later that week, against my better judgment, I agreed to join them for a casual outing at a cafe downtown. Roxalana had invited me with a smile too wide to be genuine, insisting, "It'll be good for us." Part of me wanted to decline, but another part wanted to see what performance they would put on in public. The cafe was buzzing, filled with chatter and the hiss of steaming milk. I slid into a seat at the long table with Roxalana, Dorian, and several of their friends already gathered. Conversation was light, surface level, until Dorian's voice rose above the hum. He gestured toward me, smirk curling. "She's just staying in the house temporarily, until we move in after the wedding." The laughter was immediate. Friends clapped him on the shoulder, nodding at Roxalana. "Congratulations! Such a perfect home for you two." One woman leaned across the table, eyes wide. "I saw the pictures online. It's gorgeous." My ears burned. The cafe's air felt too thin, the walls too close. Their lie had left my living room, my street, my parents' whispers. It was now alive in public, carried on the lips of strangers. I swallowed the fire in my throat, forcing my voice steady. "Interesting. Last I checked, my name is still on the deed." The laughter faltered. The friends exchanged awkward glances. Dorian's grin stiffened. Roxalana jumped in quickly, her laugh sharp and false. "Oh, she's joking. Don't mind her." But no one looked entirely convinced. The weight of my words lingered on the table, a challenge no one dared answer. Inside, humiliation twisted with something harder. They wanted to make me invisible, but I wasn't disappearing without a fight. I excused myself after finishing my coffee, rising before anyone else could respond. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, heads turning. Walking out of the cafe, I felt the cool Portland air against my skin, a relief from the suffocating performance inside. My chest still burned, but it wasn't shame anymore. It was resolve. That was my warning, I told myself as I walked down the block, heels striking the sidewalk with purpose. The next time, there would be no words, only action. Their laughter, their smirks, their dismissal, it no longer hurt the way it once had. It fueled me. And if they insisted on ignoring the warning, they would soon learn exactly what I was capable of. It was a Tuesday evening, and the sky over Portland hung low with a gray drizzle. I pulled into my driveway after a long day, eager for the comfort of my own home. My key, cool in my hand, slid into the lock as it had thousands of times before. Only this time it caught. I tried again, turning it harder. The metal stuck, grinding against something unfamiliar. A strange jolt of panic rippled through me. This was my door, my lock. My hand knew its weight, its give, every twist of its grooves. And yet it resisted me, as though my own house was hesitating to let me in. Finally, after jiggling and pushing, the door gave way. The sound of tools clinking greeted me from the other side. Inside, a man I had never seen before knelt with a toolbox open, carefully packing away screwdrivers and drills. I froze in the doorway, water dripping from my coat onto the mat. "What are you doing in my house?" He glanced up, startled, then looked quickly toward the living room. "I was just finishing up." The disbelief burned through me, boiling over into fury. Trust is like a lock. Once broken, it's never the same. Before I could speak again, Dorian appeared from the hallway. His posture was relaxed, his smile infuriatingly smug, like a host greeting a guest. "Ah, Sophrona," he said smoothly. "Don't worry, I called him. It was time to update the locks. Security reasons, you understand." I dropped my bag to the floor. "Security? This is my house. Who gave you the authority to touch my locks?" He shrugged, as though my outrage were an overreaction. "Your mom agreed it'd be safer for the family if I handled it. You know, better keys, better control." "Family?" I spat the word. "You are not family. You're a guest, barely that, and you changed my locks?" The locksmith, sensing the storm brewing, stood awkwardly. "Look, I was just doing what I was hired for." "I don't want any trouble here." He snapped his toolbox shut and hurried for the door, avoiding my eyes. As the door clicked behind him, the silence thickened. I took a step closer, pointing to the new deadbolt gleaming in the frame. "This isn't just metal you tampered with, it's control. You think if you can change the lock, you can change who this house belongs to." Dorian leaned against the wall, arms folded, his smirk never faltering. "You're making this more dramatic than it needs to be. Think of it as preparation. When Roxalana and I settle in, everything will already be set." My fists tightened at my sides. Every word he spoke felt like a nail hammered into the coffin of their pretense. They weren't just invading my space. They were declaring ownership without ever earning it. I didn't scream. I didn't throw him out. I stood there, the fury settling cold and deliberate in my chest, and filed this moment away. Evidence, proof of their trespass. Another stone for the wall I would build against them. That night, I stormed into my parents' home, the anger still raw on my face. They were seated in the living room, television flickering, the calmness of their evening mocking the storm inside me. "You let him change my locks," I said without preamble. My mother's head tilted, her expression one of patient annoyance. "He was only thinking of your safety. Don't twist it into something ugly." I laughed, sharp and humorless. "Safety? Giving control of my front door to someone who doesn't own a brick of that house? That's not safety. That's criminal trespassing." My father sighed, rubbing his temple. "Don't exaggerate. He's practically family. You need to stop making everything so confrontational." My jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Their words didn't just dismiss me. They confirmed my deepest fear. They were all standing behind him, not me. And with their silence, they were rewriting the rules of my life as if I had no voice at all. 2 days later, Roxalana came by unannounced. I found her in my kitchen, handbag tossed casually on the counter, scrolling through her phone as if she had always belonged there. I stared at her. "What are you doing here?" She looked up, unfazed. "Don't be dramatic. You'll always have a guest room here." The words hit harder than Dorian's little tenant, guest room, guest, in my own home. I stepped closer, my voice low but sharp. Guest? This is my house. My name is on every paper, every payment. You don't get to reduce me to a visitor. She set her phone down, exhaling in exaggerated patience. You've been so touchy lately. This doesn't have to be a fight. We all know you don't need this place the way we do. You can still stay here, but let's be realistic. It's better for the family if we use it. Her fingers drummed on the counter like she was already measuring where her belongings would go. Inside my chest, something snapped into clarity. They weren't just planning to take my house, they were planning to exile me within it, to relegate me to the margins while they moved in as the rightful heirs. I said nothing more. The silence was deliberate now, each second drawing tighter like a bowstring ready to snap. I picked up her handbag, placed it back in her arms, and opened the door. Her eyes narrowed, but she walked out without another word, her heels clicking like punctuation against the pavement. I stood in my living room long after she left, staring at the new locks gleaming under the porch light. For weeks I had tried to reason, to warn, to hold back. But reason had been twisted into weakness. I realized then that silence would no longer shield me. It was time to prepare, not just to protect my house, but to prove beyond doubt that I was the owner, not the tenant they wanted me to become. They thought they'd demoted me, I whispered to the empty room. But they were about to learn I was the landlord, and eviction was coming. My warning had fallen on deaf ears. The dinner where I told them plainly that my house wasn't a bargaining chip had changed nothing. Then came the locks, and even that violation hadn't made them pause. If anything, it emboldened them. The silence I held on to, the hope that they would recognize my boundaries if I stayed calm, proved useless. What grew in its place was a darker certainty. They were planning something bigger. I thought about a saying I'd read once. When people show you their greed, believe them the first time. And Dorian had shown me who he was the first time he smirked and called me a tenant. Roxalana had shown me with every dismissive shrug, every stolen glance that screamed entitlement. My parents had shown me with their quiet nods, their empty smiles, their refusal to defend me. I stopped expecting them to correct themselves. Instead, I began looking for the proof that I knew was waiting in the shadows. Proof that would explain why their arrogance had grown so unchecked. Proof that would tell me what game they were really playing with the roof over my head. That Saturday, I stopped by my parents' house. The air smelled faintly of coffee and laundry detergent, deceptively ordinary, but as I passed the hallway toward the back study, I heard voices threading through the crack of a door left slightly ajar. I froze, listening. Roxalana's voice was clear, tinged with excitement. Once the wedding's done, we'll list the house. The profit will give us a clean start. My heart jolted. Dorian's tone followed, smooth and confident. Exactly. She won't resist forever. She'll crack. People like her always do. I pressed myself against the wall, palms flat against the paint, every muscle tight. My mother's quieter voice chimed in, almost reassuring. We can talk her into moving to an apartment, something smaller, more practical. It's for the best. She'll understand once it's explained properly. My fingers curled into fists. They weren't just plotting to live inside my house. They were planning to sell it. Sell my life out from under me, as though my 9 years of labor and sacrifice could be erased with a realtor's pen. Roxalana's laugh rang out, light but sharp. She'll manage. She always does. And Dorian sealed it with the arrogance of a conqueror. By summer, it'll be ours. I backed away slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The betrayal wasn't careless now. It was deliberate, orchestrated, and worse, approved by the very people who should have stood behind me. It wasn't just invasion. They were plotting erasure. I didn't storm in. I didn't shout through the door. I walked out of the house, down the steps, into the street, every breath heavy with restraint. If I confronted them then, they'd laugh it off. Deny, deflect, accuse me of twisting their words. They'd done it before. They'd do it again. But something had shifted inside me. Quiet rage sharpened into a colder tool. Patience. If I waited, they would expose themselves further. Their greed was too loud to stay hidden, too eager to keep contained. In America, it isn't strangers who tear families apart over money. It's blood. A house becomes a prize, siblings become rivals, and suddenly family first is just a slogan to justify betrayal. I thought of all the hours I had bent over bookkeeping, the nights I'd fallen asleep at my desk to save enough for that down payment. I thought of patching my own roof, planting my own garden, eating dollar menu meals so I could pay extra toward the principal. And now they wanted to flip my sacrifice into their payday. I drove home that evening with the decision pressed firmly in my chest. I would not warn again. I would not beg. I would prepare. A few nights later, my phone buzzed. It was Leora, my closest friend, the one person who still believed me without hesitation. "You need to hear this," she said, her voice sharp. "I was at McCleary's tonight, and guess who was holding court at the bar?" I didn't have to ask. "Dorian," she confirmed. "Loud enough for the whole room. He was bragging about how the house is practically his already. Said you're just holding it until the paperwork catches up." My grip tightened on the phone. Leora continued, disgust dripping from her words. "People laughed, Sophrona. They raised their glasses to him. Mock congratulations, like he'd already won something. He made your home into a punchline over drinks." I closed my eyes, the image sharp in my mind. My living room, my garden, my years of sacrifice, reduced to bar chatter and clinking mugs. My humiliation wasn't just private anymore. It was being toasted in public. Fury surged, but beneath it was clarity. If he was arrogant enough to brag like that, then arrogance would be his weakness. People who believe they've already won stop being careful. I pictured him, beer in hand, smirking as though I'd already been erased. That image burned hotter than shame. It became fuel. That night I sat in my car outside my house, engine off, staring at the faint glow of my porch light through the drizzle. "They were plotting to sell my life out from under me," I whispered to the empty car, "and bragging about it over drinks." I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles blanched, resolve tightening like a steel band. The fury no longer spun me into despair. It sharpened into strategy. The next time they mocked me, it wouldn't be behind closed doors or over beer mugs. I'd be there, standing in the light they tried to steal, and they'd choke on their own lies. The moment I stepped through the front door of my parents' house, I knew this night would be different. Relatives I hadn't seen in months filled the rooms. Cousins, aunts, uncles, even my father's sister Octavia, who rarely traveled. They greeted me warmly, hugging, asking about my garden, complimenting the necklace I wore. None of them knew the truth of the war raging under this roof. To them, tonight was just another family gathering. But I saw the way Roxalana and Dorian moved among them, hosting as though they owned the place, their smiles wide, their gestures expansive. Dorian poured wine into glasses like a head of household. Roxalana fluttered from guest to guest, accepting congratulations as though it were their party. They radiated the kind of confidence that only comes from a lie believed too long. I reminded myself of a line I once read. A lie doesn't become truth just because more people believe it. I repeated it like a shield as I watched them laugh, as if my house already belonged to them. Tonight, I felt the storm inside me coiling, waiting. Dinner was served at the long table, voices overlapping, plates clinking, wine poured freely. The conversation flowed. Children's school updates, retirement plans, vacation dreams. For a moment, it almost felt normal, almost safe. Then Dorian's voice cut across the table, smooth but sharp. "Well, she's just the little tenant until we take over." The room stilled. Some relatives laughed politely, thinking it a joke. Others glanced around, uncertain. My fork stopped midair. Humiliation washed over me, hot and sharp. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. My father cleared his throat, but neither said a word in my defense. My parents urged calm, eyes flicking to me. "Don't cause a scene." I sat back slowly, pulse thundering in my ears. If they wanted a scene, I thought, I'd give them one they'd never forget. I placed my fork down gently, eyes locking on Dorian's smug grin. Every nerve screamed at me to explode, but instead, I let my silence hang, heavier than any shout, preparing for my moment. It arrived sooner than I expected. Octavia, my father's sister, leaned across the table with a smile. She hadn't been part of the tension, didn't know the weight her words carried when she asked innocently, "So, when did you two buy the house?" All eyes shifted to Roxalana and Dorian. Dorian didn't hesitate. "Oh, it was last year. Practically ours now." The casualness of the lie sliced through me. It wasn't just audacity, it was performance, spoken with the certainty of someone convinced the world would bend to him. The laughter faltered. Confusion spread, heads turned, eyes darted between me and them. A silence heavier than the meal settled over the table. I sat very still, waiting. The lie now hung in the air, undeniable, and every relative felt its weight. The illusion they had built cracked wide open, and the timing was mine to claim. I stood, slowly, deliberately. Every head turned as I pulled my phone from my pocket. Without a word, I connected it to the television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered, then came alive. Gasps filled the room as grainy footage appeared. Roxalana and Dorian in my living room, lugging boxes, rearranging furniture, speaking as though I weren't there. The sound of their voices carried clear. Dorian's laughter, Roxalana pointing to rooms, claiming spaces. The silence that followed was deafening. I let the footage play a moment longer before setting a folder on the table. "This house," I said, my voice firm, "is mine, paid in full, in my name only." I opened the folder, revealing the deed, the receipts, the proof. My hands didn't shake. I had prepared for this moment, and every second of their arrogance had led us here. "If I'm just a tenant," I continued, locking eyes with Dorian, "then consider this your eviction notice." A ripple spread through the room, gasps, murmurs, disbelief. My relatives turned on them, eyes wide with shock and disgust. Roxalana's smile had vanished, her face pale. Dorian shifted in his chair, his grin stiffening, no words ready to rescue him now. The table had turned into a courtroom, and the verdict was clear. I gathered my phone calmly, disconnected it from the television, and slipped the folder back into my bag. Silence still reigned, broken only by the faint clinking of glasses as relatives fidgeted. I didn't wait for excuses. I didn't wait for my parents' weary pleas or my sister's false tears. I lifted my chin, stepped away from the table, and walked toward the door. Inside, my thoughts were steady. The truth was out now. And once the truth is seen, it can't be unseen. As I reached the porch, the night air cool against my skin, I knew this battle wasn't finished. Their desperation would not vanish with exposure. It would harden, sharpen, and return uglier than ever. But tonight, for the first time in months, I walked away holding the power. The room was still vibrating from the video I had just shown them. My relatives sat stiff, forks frozen mid-air, their faces split between shock, shame, and disbelief. Dorian's smirk had finally vanished, replaced by a flush of red climbing his neck. Roxalana stared down at her plate as though she could hide inside the china. The air carried the weight of a courtroom, each person waiting for the next blow to fall. No one moved. My parents shifted uneasily, my mother wringing her hands in her lap, my father adjusting his glasses. A cousin whispered something to another, and the quiet ripple made my skin prickle. I reminded myself of a line that had kept me steady all these years. When you stand in your truth, even silence is an ally. Tonight, silence stood with me, pressing against Dorian, against Roxalana, forcing them to face what they had tried to deny, and I knew it was time to strike. I straightened, looking directly at them. My voice was clear, cutting through the silence. "If I'm a tenant, then consider this my eviction notice. For you." Gasps erupted around the table. My Aunt Octavia pressed her palm to her mouth. My cousin shook his head slowly. Dorian sat forward, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You don't mean that." "Yes, I do," I answered, steady. Roxalana's face crumpled with shock. "You would do this to your own sister?" I met her stare without flinching. "Family doesn't destroy one of its own for profit." My father finally spoke, his voice breaking the tense stillness. "Please, Sophrona, don't destroy the family over this." I turned to him, pain sharpening my words. I'm not the one destroying it. Look at what's been happening. Look at how easily you chose their comfort over my sacrifices. For the first time all night, I saw heads nodding, relatives murmuring agreement under their breath. The tide was shifting. The truth, once revealed, could not be pushed back into the shadows, but Dorian wasn't done. He slammed his fist onto the table, his voice raised. She's unstable. She can't manage the house alone. Look at her. Paranoid, dramatic, clinging to paperwork like it proves anything. Roxalana jumped in, desperation dripping from her voice. She's selfish, always thinking about herself, never about the family. We're trying to build a future here, and she refuses to help. Gaslighting, the same trick they had always used. But this time, I didn't waver. I reached into my bag, pulled out the thick stack of bank statements I had carried with me. I spread them on the table like a deck of cards. 9 years of payments, every cent mine, every repair, every tax bill, every late-night worry that kept me awake. That's not selfish, that's survival. And this house, it stands because I refused to give up when no one else was there to help. The murmurs grew louder. Relatives leaned forward, scanning the papers. My uncle muttered, "She's right, it's her name on every one of these." My aunt shook her head at Roxalana, disappointment written across her face. I held their eyes, calm as I spoke again. You wanted to convince them I was weak, but all you've done is prove your greed. Roxalana's breathing quickened. She clutched her chest suddenly, staggering back from the table. I can't, she gasped, collapsing to the floor. Chaos erupted. Relatives rushed to her side, voices overlapping. Get water! Call someone! My mother knelt beside her, patting her cheek frantically. But I stood where I was, watching. Her eyes fluttered, her lips pursed dramatically. It wasn't fainting. It was theater, the final act of a desperate liar. Dorian rounded on me, pointing an accusing finger. See what you've done? You're tearing her apart. I stepped closer, my voice cold. Truth only tears lies apart. The room split into chaos, some relatives tending to Roxalana, others muttering at the spectacle, still others staring at me with dawning respect. And through it all, I remained steady, because I knew what I had given them tonight wasn't just proof. It was judgment. I gathered my papers back into my bag, slipped my phone into my pocket, and turned toward the door. The voices rose behind me, pleas, accusations, whispers, but none of it mattered anymore. As I reached the threshold, I paused, my hand on the frame, and let my final thought rise above the noise. They can fake fainting, cry, beg, but I have given them their eviction. Their time in my house is over. Then I stepped outside into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a seal of freedom. Behind me, I heard only stunned silence and frantic whispers. What I didn't realize then was that their desperation wouldn't stop with humiliation. They were about to show me just how dangerous greed can become when lies no longer hold. The night I left my parents' house after confronting them with the video and the deed, I felt strangely calm. There had been chaos, gasps, shouting, Roxalana collapsing in her dramatic performance, but beneath it all, clarity had cut through like glass. They had been exposed, their masks torn off, and I had walked away with my head high. Yet clarity is not peace. As I drove home, the silence in my car felt heavier than the voices I'd left behind. I knew this wasn't the end. Their humiliation would not stop them. People who believe entitlement is their birthright don't vanish when you confront them. They scheme harder. Napoleon Hill once wrote, "Action is the real measure of intention." That line echoed in my mind. Words had failed us long ago. Warnings had been ignored. My family's actions had revealed everything about their intentions, and now it was my turn to act. The next morning, with the taste of steel in my resolve, I picked up the phone and called a locksmith of my own. And by mid-afternoon, I stood at the threshold of my house, watching the locksmith's gloved hands dismantle the old locks piece by piece. The clink of metal echoed like punctuation. Final, deliberate. He replaced the doorknobs, fitted new deadbolts, even reinforced the sliding glass door with upgraded hardware. I followed him from door to door, the air heavy with the smell of fresh metal and oil. Every turn of that screwdriver, I thought, restores what they tried to steal. He explained the system patiently, handing me the new set of keys, sleek, untouched, solid in my palm. Each one felt like a reclamation of my authority. The shame they'd tried to pin on me washed away in that moment, replaced with empowerment that settled deep in my bones. As he tightened the final screw, he looked at me and nodded. "No one's getting in here without your permission now." I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. That's exactly how it should be. When he left, the sound of the door closing behind him wasn't ordinary. It was a seal, a declaration. My sanctuary had been restored, not by pleading for respect, but by building walls they could no longer breach. That evening, as twilight painted the sky, I heard the crunch of tires in my driveway. Peering through the blinds, I saw Roxalana's car pull up, Dorian stepping out confidently. They approached the door like conquerors returning to claim their spoils. I stood silently at the window as Dorian shoved his key into the lock. The metallic scrape echoed in the quiet street. He twisted once, twice, harder each time. Nothing. "Why isn't it working?" Roxalana hissed, frustration tightening her voice. "Try yours," he snapped, rattling his own key again. She fumbled with her set, jamming it in. The lock held firm, immovable. "She's locked us out," Dorian growled, stepping back, his face contorted in disbelief. I let the curtain fall, a slow satisfaction rising in me. Poetic justice, watching them realize that what they thought was already theirs had slipped through their fingers. They had treated me like an intruder in my own house, and now the roles had reversed. Their panic was almost comical. The sound of their futile attempts was a symphony I hadn't known I needed. Finally, I opened the door, just a crack. Enough for my face to meet theirs, not enough to invite them inside. I stood tall, the porch light casting me in a glow that felt symbolic, like judgment itself. "This house opens only to respect," I said evenly. "Until then, you'll never cross this threshold again." Roxalana's eyes widened, her lips parting. "You can't mean that. We're family." Dorian's temper flared, his voice rising. "You think you can just shut us out after everything we've planned?" "Yes," I said simply, and pushed the door closed. The sound of the lock sliding into place was louder than their protests. It was finality made audible. Inside, I leaned against the door, heart steady. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe in my own home. Not because they had given me peace, but because I had claimed it for myself. They could yell, they could pound, they could rage in the driveway, but the door was closed, and it would remain closed until respect stood on the other side. That night, I sat on my couch, sipping tea, listening to the quiet hum of my house. Victory tasted like silence, firm and unshaken. Yet beneath it, vigilance remained. Locks could keep them out, but I knew desperation had a way of finding cracks. I stared at the walls I had painted with my own hands, the windows I had cleaned, the garden outside that bloomed from years of patience. Locks are strong, I thought, but greed is relentless. And I knew their next move wouldn't just target my doors. It would strike deeper, at the very walls of my home. The morning after I changed the locks, I woke with a different kind of quiet in my chest. Not peace, not yet, but the fragile sense of safety I hadn't felt in weeks. I brewed coffee, letting the smell fill the kitchen, and sat at the table with the sun filtering through the blinds. For the first time in a long while, my home felt like mine again. Still, vigilance lingered. My mind replayed everything that had led to this point. The insults, the staged fainting, the shameless lies in front of relatives. I thought of a phrase I had once read. "What you allow is what will continue." I had allowed too much. And when I finally stopped, when I slammed the door on their schemes, the fallout began to show. The price of their desperation was coming due, and it wasn't me who would be paying anymore. The first sign came from my cousin, who called later that week with the kind of hesitant tone people use when delivering bad news. "Did you hear?" she asked softly. "Roxalana and Dorian moved back into your parents' place. It's crowded over there." Crowded was an understatement. 4 adults crammed into a modest house that was never meant for more than 2. The living room had been turned into a makeshift bedroom. A mattress leaned against the wall during the day, dragged into the center of the room at night. The dining table was buried in piles of clothes and paperwork. Privacy no longer existed. Every word overheard, every argument public. I imagined it vividly. My sister complaining about space, Dorian sulking in corners, my parents sighing over the noise and bills. The poetic justice was sharp. The very house they had tried to force from me was the one they were now missing most. They tried to steal my peace, I thought as I sipped my coffee. Now they've lost theirs. I didn't gloat. I didn't call to rub it in. I simply let the image sit with me, a reminder that sometimes justice arrives not in courtrooms, but in cramped hallways and sleepless nights. A few days later, Leora stopped by, her expression carrying news even before she spoke. "You should know," she said, settling onto my couch. "Dorian lost his job." I raised an eyebrow. "Already?" She nodded, lips pressed tight. Word about the family showdown spread. Someone filmed part of it, Sophrona. The video's been passed around. His employer saw it, him shouting, "You laying down the truth," Roxalana collapsing. They didn't want that kind of reputation tied to their company. They let him go this morning. Conduct unbecoming. For a moment, I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. Not with triumph, but with the strange calm that comes when arrogance finally meets its consequence. I pictured him packing boxes at his desk, co-workers avoiding his gaze, pride unraveling with each stapler and photo frame stuffed into cardboard. "Respect isn't given, it's earned," I murmured. "And arrogance always collects its debt." Leora gave a small smile. "Exactly." The fall had begun, and it was swift. The man who paraded through my home as though it were his kingdom now faced the world stripped of power. And it hadn't taken a single word from me. But it wasn't only him. Roxalana, once surrounded by admirers, began to feel the cold shoulder of a community that thrives on gossip. I heard about it first through whispers. Then I saw it myself. At the grocery store one afternoon, I spotted her in the next aisle. 2 women she had once considered close friends turned their carts sharply away when they noticed her. Their whispers carried just far enough. "We thought it was her house." Guess not. The sting on Roxalana's face was unmistakable. For someone who thrived on appearances, on likes and comments, on congratulations poured beneath stolen photos, the silence of abandonment was louder than any insult. Her social media, once flooded with hearts and claps, grew quiet. Posts went unliked. Old supporters whispered instead of cheering. The validation she had craved had withered. When lies unravel, I thought as I watched her fumble at the checkout line, they take your audience with them. Her isolation was the most brutal punishment of all. Not one I delivered, but one she had earned. That evening, I sat in my home, the house that was truly mine, listening to the steady tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the ordinary sounds that had once been drowned by fear. I no longer felt the need to fight, not in the way I once had. Their world was collapsing without my hand on it. Sometimes the best revenge is no revenge at all, just letting people choke on the fruit of their own planting. I leaned back, closing my eyes, feeling grim satisfaction mingled with quiet dignity. But as the night settled around me, one last shadow crept into my thoughts. I had underestimated their desperation before, and though they were unraveling, I sensed they weren't done. One last move lingered. The silence that filled my house in the weeks that followed was unlike any silence I had known before. It wasn't the silence of being ignored or diminished, the kind that had pressed against my chest when my family dismissed my sacrifices. This was a clean silence, a silence earned. I would sit at my kitchen table in the mornings, coffee warming my palms, and listen to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the soft breeze that rattled the window panes. My home breathed again, free from intrusion. But vigilance never left me. Peace is fragile. I remembered a line I had once read. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. And I knew justice had to be sealed, not merely hoped for. That thought kept me steady, even when part of me longed to let down my guard. One afternoon, I opened my email to find a message with no subject line. My stomach clenched before I even clicked it open. "You'll regret this. The house will never be yours." The words were typed in bold, the tone dripping with venom I recognized instantly. Dorian had never been clever with his threats. His bravado always carried the same cheap rhythm. He thought hiding behind anonymity would disguise him, but even his rage had a signature. For a brief moment, fear flickered in me. My hand trembled against the mouse, but the fear did not linger. It hardened into resolve. I had lived long enough to know their true weapon wasn't power. It was intimidation, and fear only worked if you let it take root. "Fear is their weapon," I whispered to myself. "Law will be mine." I had already prepared. Weeks before, when the first boundary had been crossed, I filed a no trespassing order with the local police. That paperwork had been my insurance policy, waiting for the day desperation pushed them too far. The very next evening, desperation arrived. Dorian's car pulled up to my driveway, headlights slicing across the lawn. He stormed toward the porch, his shoulders hunched, fists balled at his sides. I watched from inside, heart steady, as he reached the door. But before his hand touched the handle, flashing red and blue lights washed across the neighborhood. Police cruisers rolled up behind him, sirens silenced, but presence undeniable. Neighbors peeked through curtains, doors cracked open as the scene unfolded. An officer stepped out, voice firm. "Sir, you've been served a no trespassing order. You're not allowed on this property. Step back." Dorian froze, his anger colliding with the authority standing in front of him. He tried to bluster. "This is my fiancé's house. I have a right." But the officer cut him off. "You have no rights here, not by law, not by ownership. If you return, you'll be arrested. Consider this your final warning." I opened the door just enough to meet the officer's eyes. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded. "You did the right thing, ma'am." And for the first time, I believed it. Days later, as I was sorting through old files in my study, I found something I hadn't seen in years, an envelope tucked into the back of a drawer. My breath caught as I recognized the handwriting, my father's. With trembling hands, I unfolded the letter. His words were simple but steady, written years ago before he passed. "Sofrona, I know you've carried more than your share. I see how hard you work, how much you give up to keep moving forward. One day, this house will be yours, and you'll know the peace you've earned. Build your life here. This house will always be yours." The tears came before I could stop them. Not of grief, but of release. My father had seen me, truly seen me, even when others chose not to. His words reached across years, a bridge of validation stronger than any lie my family could spread. I pressed the letter to my chest, whispering, "I kept it, Dad." I kept it. Later that week, as I trimmed roses in my front yard, my elderly neighbor, Mr. Thompson, walked over slowly with his cane. He had lived next door for decades, a quiet man who rarely offered more than a wave. But today, he stopped at the edge of my lawn and said, "You did the right thing. Don't ever let anyone take away what you built." His voice was steady, his gaze kind. That single acknowledgement carried more weight than all the hollow applause my sister had ever sought on social media. "Thank you," I replied, my throat thick. "Family isn't always blood," he added, giving me a nod before turning back toward his porch. I stood there for a long moment, letting his words sink in. He was right. As spring settled fully over Portland, I sat one evening on my porch, watching the light fade over the neighborhood. My journey played in my mind, the insults, the betrayals, the humiliations. From being called the little tenant in my own home, to finally standing tall with the eviction notice and the law at my side. They had tried to strip me of dignity, but in the end, it was their masks that crumbled. They had plotted, lied, and humiliated themselves, and I had stood firm. Strength, dignity, peace. That was the legacy I chose. Family isn't always blood, I thought. Sometimes family is the peace you build, the justice you protect, and the people who respect it. For the first time in years, I wasn't just living in my house, I was home. And yet, one thought lingered as the night deepened. Peace must be guarded, always. And I would guard mine, for as long as I lived,